it up right away. We might even be able to get it up today. So for anyone who is not familiar with SSTI, we are a network of reform-minded state DOTs. We were founded in 2010, and I am at the University of Wisconsin, but SSTI is jointly operated by the University of Wisconsin and Smart Growth America. We work in 3 ways. We are an executive level community of practice where the CEOs of DOTs get together and they can talk to each other and share experiences and learn from each other. They usually get together about once a year in a small group. We're also a source of direct technical assistance and to agencies on transformative and replicable smart transportation reform efforts, and a lot of that material is up on our website. And that gets us to the 3rd way that we work, which is a resource to the wider transportation community. And that includes state and local and federal agencies. And again, you can find a lot of our materials up on the SSTI website and find out what we've been doing and what we're planning in the future. And we have materials from other sources as well. You can also subscribe to SSTI newsletter on the page, the front page of our website, which is ssti.us, and you can follow us on Twitter. Again, you can do that on the front of our website, which is ssti.us. And for those who are just joining us, we will be taking questions at the end. We will leave questions. We will leave time for people to ask questions. But if you want to type in a question at any point during the webinar, just type it into the chat box and we'll get to those at the end. If you don't see the chat box, you may need to hit the little orange arrow in the upper right of your screen and the chat box will appear. So our speakers today, I'm very excited to have both of our speakers here. They've really been transforming how Florida looks and feels to everybody using the streets and roads in the state and how we think about transportation for everyone. DeWayne Carver is the Florida Department of Transportation's Complete Streets Program Manager. He manages the department's transition to context-based design, also known as Complete Streets, working with various offices throughout the department. He provides technical assistance based on his prior experience with walkable thoroughfare design, form-based coding, and the city and regional planning. Before coming to FDOT, he worked in the private and public sector in real estate development, planning, transit, and university research. After DeWayne, we'll be hearing from Billy Hattaway. He is the Director of Transportation Director for the City of Orlando. But before taking that job, he was the District 1 Secretary for Florida Department of Transportation. And beyond being the District 1 Secretary, he was tasked with trying to make the whole state more pedestrian and bicycle friendly. A job that brought him a lot of publicity and accolades, which you can Google and find out all of the awards that he has received and accolades. And I'm not going to go through all of them. He serves on a lot of different committees and boards for national and state organizations. And he's been a wonderful champion for safer streets, improved multimodal transportation, and more humane communities. If I said everything that Billy had done, it would take a long time. So these are both wonderful speakers, and I am going to get out of the way and let them go ahead and talk to you. So first up, DeWayne, you have the control of the mouse and the slides.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you for offering us the chance to come and talk to you about some of the changes that we're trying to make in Florida, starting with the Florida Department of Transportation. I wanted to add just a little bit to that and say Billy and I had a chance to work together in the private sector for a while before he returned to DOT. And then once he did come back to DOT, I actually came over to work with him again on some of the similar to the stuff that we had been doing in the private sector, designing walkable, livable communities, and we wanted to try to bring some of that work and experience we've had in the private sector to our work here at DOT. So this is a little bit of a discussion of how we did that and sort of how it's going and some of the changes that we've made. So I'm going to kind of jump right into it here. And there's my mouse. Okay. All right. When Billy first came over to DOT, our secretary was a man named Anand Prasad, and at the same time, we had these dangerous by design reports come out, and a lot of the folks on the webinar probably heard of those. There's been a couple of them that came out right now, that have come out recently, and one of the things that pointed out was that Florida has, and has really had for many years, an unenviable position as being one of the worst states for bicyclist and pedestrian fatalities in terms of our rate per thousand population. And the secretary at the time said that's not where we want to be in Florida. We don't want to be at the number one. We don't want to be number one on this particular list. And so he gave Billy a whole list of things when he brought him in to try to help change this, a whole bunch of things that he wanted to do. And one of those was to put together a complete streets policy. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that all kind of played out. Here's just some statistics. The problem is intractable. It's one that we've been working on for many years. And even with Billy here, we did a lot of education and enforcement. The piece that's taken the longest to kind of get running is the engineering side of it. Engineering is not something you can run out and change overnight, but it is something that we realized needed to be done. The secretary who came in after Secretary Prasad was Jim Boxhold. And Secretary Boxhold put it very plain and simple. He said, we've got to put the right street in the right place. We've got to make our streets match the places where they're found if we want to solve this problem. And that's exactly what we were trying to do with complete streets, and that's where we've been headed with it. The approach that's called complete streets, which we call putting the right road in the right place, had already been adopted by about 60 different cities and counties and MPOs and different places in Florida. And so this is one of the reasons that we had to do it at DOT was frankly because all our other cities and counties were doing it already. When we came to work there, they had these complete streets design parameters they wanted to use. They didn't match with what we were doing. We were still using highway parameters from the 60s and 70s sometimes that were all about speed and moving automobiles. And so we really had a mismatch between what our state DOT was trying to offer and what our cities and counties needed to see. They understood something that we've come to understand as well, which is that this is, yes, it is a safety issue, but it's also an economic development issue. It's a quality of life issue. All those things come into play in cities and towns, and that's why you see so many of them have already adopted these things. And so that's why DOT needs to get on board with it as well. So in September 2014, we adopted our Complete Streets policy. It's right here. It's very short. You can read the whole thing on our website. I'm going to ask you to read the tiny bit there. And it promotes safety, quality of life, and economic development. Those are the three things that we've kind of built everything around for our policy. If we're doing those things, then we're moving in the right direction with Complete Streets. It also talks about that we're going to have a context-sensitive system of complete streets. When we wrote this, from our other experience, we realized that you really can't talk about complete streets unless you're talking about the place where the street is found. So you have to understand the place-making potential of this and the ability of the place to define how that street's going to function and whether or not it's going to be a complete street. So we want to put that in our policy. And we pull out specifically that we're going to serve all these different users. Yes, we'll serve cyclists. Yes, we'll serve pedestrians. We also realized we had to serve freight handlers, motorists, and other folks as well. And that was a little bit of a surprise to us. And the ones who actually explained to us why it's important to deal with all those other people actually were our friends over at Smart Growth America. Let me see if I can get my slide. There we go. Hold on. Okay. So when we had adopted our policy, it was great. We were a state DOT. We had a complete streets policy, and we had no idea where to go with it after that. And through a circumstance, it just so happened that Smart Growth America actually had a program that they had been funded to do, which was to go out and find DOTs that had adopted complete streets policies and didn't know what to do with them and help them figure out how to make those policies happen. And they'd done this for a couple of other state DOTs, and we talked to those DOTs, and they said, yeah, the Smart Growth folks are great. You should work with them. So we did. And they came in, and we had a whole series of workshops, 4 or 5 workshops actually in 2015, right after we had signed our policy. And I was the state bike ped coordinator at the time, and I thought I knew what Complete Streets was. It's about bicyclists and pedestrians, right? And Roger Millar, who was the director at Smart Growth at the time we were doing this, said, if you make this about cyclists and pedestrians, you will fail. This has got to be bigger than cyclists and pedestrians, and it is bigger than cyclists and pedestrians. And then they proceeded to, we had all these people together from around the state for these series of statewide workshops, and we had a whole day's lecture on freight and why freight is important and how to handle freight in your downtowns and how logistics work. All these things that were much bigger than what I thought Complete Streets was all about. But they understood the big picture behind all of that, and were able to help us gauge what DOT needed to do there. So they came back, they went through our website and found about like 150 documents or something that needed to be updated to make Complete Streets work at DOT. We asked for a smaller list, and they cut it down to about 12. So they said, if you modify these 12 documents, everything else that you do looks at these 12 documents, and if you change these, then eventually everything else will change along with it. And so that's what we decided to do. So, and we knew that the approach that we wanted to do this was to, again, trying to put the right street in the right place. And so then we had to come up with, well, okay, what does that look like exactly? What do you mean when you say the right place? How does that work? And so this launched us into a whole review of how places are defined and what you do with those. And we came up with this context classification system, which I'm going to go through in a little bit of detail here in a few minutes. You can go to our website at flcompletestreets.com if you want a more kind of gruesome, in-depth look at our context classification system, but I'm going to kind of breeze through it here today. But basically, it allows us to define place so that we know what kind of street then would go into that place. So that's in our context classification document, which is on our website. And once we had our place defined, then we were able to update our design criteria, and we now have a new manual, the FDOT design manual. It replaces what we have been using for the last 20 or 30 years with this new design manual, which is context-based. And so under the new manual, if you want to know how to build a roadway or make an improvement of some kind, the first thing you do is you go and say, well, what context am I in? And then that will tell you what criteria to use to build that particular thing. So we'll kind of walk through this a little bit today and sort of show how that's working for us. So we'll talk about what the context classifications are and a little bit about how we use those then at the department. So here's the kind of a layout of what our context classifications are. They go from the most natural conditions you can think of to the most urban conditions you can think of. And in case you hadn't smelled it on us already, Billy and I were new urbanists in our previous work, and still are, at heart at least, even we work for governments. This looks a lot like the new urbanist transect system. And so, yes, we borrowed heavily from that, but the idea of organizing space on this continuum made a lot of sense. It was already pretty well accepted in planning practice, and so we found this is actually an easier sell than we thought it would be, even at a place like the Department of Transportation, which was really not that familiar with it. So I'm going to go through very quickly what our context classifications look like, in case you haven't seen them before. The natural condition we have here in Florida, these are places that are state parks, national forests. These are places that are preserved and they will never be built on. So that's important to understand from a planning perspective. If it's natural today, it will be natural in the future. We can just assume it's going to be that way from now on. It has its own context classification, C1. As you get to a more urban condition, we have the rural conditions, and these are places that, yeah, they may not be built on today, but they may be built on tomorrow because they're basically in a reserve location where they could be urbanized at some point. In Florida, the odds are that if it's farmland today, in 20 years, it may not be farmland. So it's important to know the distinction between what's empty today and will always be empty versus what's empty today and could be a shopping center tomorrow. So we wanted to make sure this distinction was clear as we look at our land context. We also, and this came out, I'll show you in a minute, the NCHRP study that helped us to formulate some of this, but also this is concept of a rural town. A lot of states may have the same problem where a small town, because it's surrounded by so much empty space, when it gets looked at by the census, the density figures don't work to make it look like an urban place. It just makes it look like a rural place. And so our design criteria in the past really didn't have a good way to recognize the fact that in the middle of the countryside, there's this little hamlet or a village or something, and we tended to just treat it like everything else. So now we have a new way that we can actually recognize that with this rural town. And so that's what the idea is here. So we wanted to recognize that, and that was very well received by our planners and engineers here at the department. They had known for years that this was an issue and had taken heroic measures in some cases to preserve these little towns and the parking and that kind of thing. But this really let them feel like they could do that more easily. Now, when we're doing this in the new urbanist world, we don't talk about suburbia. It's not something that we plan for, or we try to eliminate it as much as we can. And so we tried to take that approach here. And they looked at it and said, you know, if we do that, most of Florida will not be on your system because you've got a lot of suburban development in Florida. And so we said, okay, well, let's see what it would actually take to make it work. And we discovered we actually really have two different flavors of suburban in Florida when we broke it into residential and commercial. So the residential development is important to understand because it's very hard to change it over time. Once things get built out with these small parcels and things like this, it's very hard to put them all back together and then redevelop that into something in the future. So from a planning perspective, we need to know that yes, it's suburban, it has disconnected blocks, it has large blocks, it's not very walkable, transit's not going to work very well there. So we need to know about those places, and we also need to know that they're going to be there for a long time. As opposed to its cousin, which is suburban commercial. Suburban commercial development has similar transportation characteristics, large blocks, it's not very walkable, that kind of thing. But because it's commercial, the blocks tend to be more likely in single ownership. You can imagine a shopping center or something like this. And these are actually not that difficult to redevelop. There's a whole little industry actually that goes out and redevelops old shopping centers into town centers and things like this, which is good for us because when you redevelop these kind of areas, you can actually tear this down and create new streets and new grids of network in here, which is terrific from a state roads perspective, because instead of having to carry all the traffic on our own state road here, we can now let some of that traffic circulate off of our system, which gives us more flexibility for what we can do on our system. So that gives us more room to go for other modes. So it's important to understand there's a distinction between the commercial and the residential flavors of suburbia on our system. Now, as you move into more urban conditions, this is what we all really like, that we like. These are the good walkable places. Most of these places were built before World War II, these urban general locations. They have the smaller lots. They're walkable. They may have alleys. We don't have a lot of alley-loaded product in Florida, but we do have some, especially on newer communities. But you see they have a good grid of streets, a good network. So our state road here, if this is in the middle of the state road here, does not necessarily have to do all the work itself. A lot of the local trips can be handled on the local street grid. So that gives us a lot more flexibility for what we can do in here. So we have a lot of this in Florida as well. We have some really great towns and cities in Florida, and a lot of them have this kind of development there. This makes it easier now for us to recognize where those are, and we can treat them differently with our criteria. And one of the things that makes that possible is that we have this network called them backage roads, or basically they're a network of streets off of our main arterial road that allows us to have these other transportation options on our road. So moving on up, every town has an urban center, and the urban centers where the buildings are going to be tallest, they're going to be up to the street. You'll usually have parking internal to the lot. You always have on-street parking. So now we have a way to recognize where these places are as well, and they have very specific types of transportation needs and design criteria. Now that we know where they are and what that place is, we can design roads to match them. And there are a few places in Florida that actually have our very most urban conditions: downtown Orlando, downtown Tampa, Jacksonville, places like that. Those are urban core conditions where you have the very highest buildings, are regionally significant, and we have a few places like that in Florida. Those also have some unique design considerations, and so we wanted to recognize that as well. So by the time we got all this put together, we realized that there were a few places that we knew were not going to fit on that continuum, and so we recognized there's a need for special districts. These are places that maybe don't fit into a particular context classification. The best examples I can give you are things like university campuses, airports, shipping facilities, ports, things like this that have very unique transportation needs, and it doesn't really make sense to even think of them necessarily as pure walkable places. And so we know that those are there, and we have those set aside in our system as well. Now, as I mentioned before, we kind of borrowed this from the New Urbanists, but at the same time, there was an NCHRP study going on actually for AASHTO, for the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, to redo the way AASHTO looks at context. And so they were coming up with a system as well. And their system was a little simpler than ours. They had, over here is their context zone. They just had rural town, suburban, urban. And we broke it out a little further than they did. We actually had, we broke our rural into 2 categories. As I said, we broke our suburban into 2 categories, and we actually split our urban into 2 different categories as well. So when you look at our design criteria, some of these are collapsed back down, but from a planning perspective, we thought it was important to have all these in Florida. This is a lot of categories, and who knows, in 5 years, they may come back and look at it and go, you know, we really don't need the C5, C6, or maybe we can break the suburban back down. I don't know, but this seems to be the best way to approach it so far, and so far it seems to be working. So, all right. So, the reason that we need to know this context classification is it helps us know what kinds of users we're going to have and what kinds of things we can plan for along this continuum of uses. So, for example, if I'm in C4, C5, or C6, I know I'm going to have pedestrians there. Those are my most urban locations. That's where pedestrians thrive. That's where you're going to find them. If you're going to find them anywhere, those are the places you're going to have them there. So if I'm doing work in those areas, I really don't need to go out and do a study or a count to see, are there any pedestrians there? I can just assume they're going to be in my town center and act as if they're there and make all my decisions based on that. So it's not necessarily to go out and do pedestrian counts necessarily in those kind of locations. I know that's where they're going to be. On the other hand, if I'm at the other end of the line in a natural condition, and I know there may be some pedestrians there, but I'm not going to put them on sidewalks because in those kind of conditions, pedestrians are found on trails and paths and things like this. So my designs are different depending on what end of the spectrum I'm in and which context I'm in. Same kind of thing for rural, you know, accommodating cyclists in a C6 urban core, I might need a cycle track or I might need bike lanes. In a rural condition, all you may need is a paved shoulder. In a natural condition, maybe I would have a shared use path separated, something like that, but I would have different types of designs based on where I am. And knowing our context lets us hone in very closely on which particular type of facility is going to be most appropriate there. If I'm in a suburban context, I have a different set of needs. I basically have unwalkable conditions, and yet I know that I have transit and pedestrians and all those folks who are there, so I know I'm going to have to deal with that whole struggle if I'm in those conditions, and I can plan for that and begin to work around it. And C2T and C4 are actually very similar, so our design criteria for those two end up being the same. So let's talk a little bit about what those criteria look like. Our FDOT design manual, we lovingly call that the FDM, has a few changes in it from what our old manual had. So I'll just give you some of the flavor of this. So for instance, our old manual for on-street parking basically said, if there's on-street parking, try to get rid of it. And if you have to have on-street parking, try to make the parking lanes 11 feet wide so that when you do get rid of them later, you can use that as a travel lane. That really is kind of what is said in there about what to do with on-street parking. Our new version, because we now can be more specific about where parking is needed, we actually can say in C2T, C4, C5, C6, if there's no on-street parking, see if you need some. Maybe it would be good to have some in there because you'll need that for speed management. So we actually can support on-street parking because we can actually be more specific about where it would be. Same kind of thing, bulb outs for pedestrian crossings. They were mentioned in the old manual, but not very much. You kind of had to squeeze them in there. Now we say, hey, look and see if you can add some bulb outs to that. Street trees, not required, but because we now recognize lower speeds are appropriate in some of these context classifications, this allows us to put the trees closer to the roadway so we can actually envelop the roadway with plantings, for instance. So, of course, you still have to look at your clear sight triangles and all those things, but we can still move stuff closer to the roadway to allow us to have the speed management that we're looking for in those locations. We made some changes to the sidewalk width, again, based on because we now can say where we expect to have more pedestrians, we don't have to use one size fits all sidewalks everywhere. We can actually have different size sidewalks, bigger ones in more urban locations. And of course, what we're going to do as far as how we use these criteria will also be influenced by what your local conditions are. So if you're a town and you're building yourself as a town, then we can give you town-sized criteria. On the other hand, if your town views itself as a suburban location and you're very happy with large box retail and shopping malls and arterial roads everywhere, we can do that for you as well. So what your plans and codes and regulations say will help us understand what we need to provide for you on our roadway system in Florida. People always ask, well, do I get to pick which context classification I am? And it's not quite that simple. DOT does have control of the state roadway. We are responsible for that, so we do determine the context classification ourselves in conjunction with local government. The biggest thing we need to know is what your future plans might be. The existing context classification is pretty cut and dry. There's a matrix you follow to go through and see what it is, but the future conditions, of course, could be different, and that will involve coordination with local government to see what those would be. All right, so this is my final slide here, and just wanted to point out, as we've been pointing out to our local governments here, that
unmuted
image of what people might think of as a complete street, and I think it is a pretty complete street. You know, you've got buses, I've got some roadway, trees, I've got buildings, but a lot of this that's here, of all the things that you see here, really only the roadway and maybe the sidewalk are actually controlled by DOT. We might control the space in here, but we probably didn't plant these trees or maintain them. That's going to be your parks department. We pay for buses, but we don't run them at Florida DOT, so that's the local government that's running that. We certainly didn't decide where the buildings could go or how high that could be. That's the local government's responsibility, and we don't keep them alive necessarily. So that's local business owners. So there's a lot of people and agencies that go into making a complete street. It's not all the department, and so that's one of the things we're trying to show is what we can do today. Though, is we can give you a street that matches more closely this context under our new system, and hopefully that will make all these other things work better together. So
that almost looks like Madison.
So that's my portion of the presentation here. Again, you can go to flcompletestreets.com if you wanted more information about our context classification. So, Billy, I'm going to pass it over to you. I think you're up next here.
Yep, I'm going to.
Go ahead, Robbie.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that I was not muted there. I just passed over the controls to you, Billy, so you can go ahead.
All right. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here today. I'm
muted.
Talk about how this helps the cities in Florida. And since I worked with the city of Orlando now for almost a year, we've already been successful in starting to take some of these efforts into improving the way the city does business from a planning and transportation standpoint. And I think DeWayne made a really good point at the end of his presentation, which is that local governments have a significant role, if not as big a role, in making sure that this is done properly in each and every region throughout the country. During the 10 years after I left the DOT in 2002, I was the state roadway design engineer and was working in the private sector. As DeWayne mentioned, I learned from working throughout the country that most all states had basically the same issues as it relates to doing things differently from a transportation standpoint. So very much at least all of the Sunbelt cities, and based on what I've seen, even a lot of the suburban areas in the Northeast and out West, as people started migrating from the downtowns, the historic downtowns, all of the suburbs were pretty much created the same way. A focus on moving cars, not providing sidewalks, not providing most of the amenities that we would expect in this day and age. And thankfully, in Florida, we did start requiring sidewalks and bike facilities back in the 90s when I was the state roadway design engineer. But we still have a lot of corridors, and this happens to be one near the University of South Florida campus, where I took a picture of this young lady walking her twins because there were no sidewalks. Even though this was adjacent to the campus, there are sidewalks now, thankfully. So certainly those of us in the transportation industry played a role in us getting here. But as DeWayne mentioned earlier, in Florida and in most of the states that I worked, local governments have total control of the land development patterns that have been created primarily since World War II, that were both a separation of uses and everything basically cul-de-sac, as I put it, onto the arterial road, whether it's a U.S. or a state highway system. And so all the heavy lifting was being done by the state or federal roads, and so the roads got wider and wider and the intersections got larger and larger. And having the uses separated exacerbated that problem because no one, if you live in a residential neighborhood, and unfortunately those are still being built, some with 3,000 single-family homes and no amenities or services, every trip has to get out onto the arterial system to get from point A to point B. And prior to World War II, when we built in a gridded fashion, like most of our historic cities in Florida, including downtown Orlando and the historic neighborhoods surrounding the downtown, we had a gridded network of streets. We had mixes of uses. And so people will still choose to drive in those conditions, especially in Florida in August, but you have lots of ways to get around, and consequently, the road system doesn't have to be quite so large, and the intersections likewise. In addition to that, one of the challenges that all of us that have been experiencing this kind of growth is this practice of putting large surface parking lots that are not used most of the time, separating the roadway from the retail that people want to get to. And you can see in this image, there's a very wide side path, which people could use to bicycle or walk, and there's sidewalks, and it's nicely landscaped. But in the vast majority of locations, no one's going to walk in this environment unless they have no other option, because it's not convenient for bicyclists or pedestrians. Likewise, the lack of connectivity in our land development patterns, and as I've said for many years to local governments, this is a problem that only takes political will to solve, and it actually reduced the operating costs of cities and counties. This happens to be two neighborhoods in Orange County outside the city of Orlando, where the back doors of these homes are only 70 feet apart, physically 70 feet apart, but it's a 7-mile drive. So trash collection, school busing, everything that every service that's provided by government ends up costing more because of this lack of connectivity. And again, it puts all the trips out onto the arterial system. So those of us in government have a lot of work to do as well. One of the challenges that we learned during the safety initiative is the challenge related to fatalities and speed. And we're in the process of becoming a Vision Zero city here in Orlando. Since I've come into the city, we're in the process of joining the Vision Zero network. And one of the primary focuses in that is we've got to get the speeds down to reduce the severity of injuries and fatalities. And you can see at only 30 miles an hour, your chances of dying goes up to 50%, and then 40, 90% of the people that get hit get killed at or above that speed. And most of our arterials are 40 or above. And one of many things that this new context classification that DeWayne mentioned allowed us to do, you can see on the left side of this chart in what was the old plans preparation manual, our minimum design speed or our design speed ranges. And you could see that the minimum was 40 miles an hour, and you could go up to 60 in an urban core based on the old manual, because there was only two classifications, urban and rural. But now with this new, more discrete classification of systems, now we can actually start and design our downtown cores for speeds as low as 25 miles an hour. Same with the rural towns. So this is a huge improvement in terms of our ability to do things differently. And one of the things that DeWayne mentioned earlier about the Complete Streets policy, I had been working on the safety initiative for about 2 years when we brought DeWayne on board, and I convinced the Secretary Prasad at the time that we couldn't continue to design our street systems the way we were doing, which was a one-size-fits-all approach to street design, and expect to solve this safety problem for the long term. Obviously, it's not something that can be fixed overnight because we've built a lot based on the old criteria, but we have to start somewhere. And so thankfully, both him and Jim Boxhole supported not just a policy, but the implementation of Complete Streets. Policies are a good start, but if you don't implement them, you can't get there from here. Likewise, we had minimum lane widths, and you can see that the old requirements were 11 foot and 12 feet. The fact is that in most cases, 12 feet was used in every single case, regardless of whether it was urban or rural. As long as there was room for 12-foot travel lanes, and that's the lane width that was used. You can see now with the new criteria the travel lane width as narrow as 10 feet can be used as long as the target speed is in the 25 to 35 mile an hour range, which is something very different. We no longer design a cross section for a speed higher than which we want people to drive. So if we want people to drive 25, we have to design the street and the adjacent land development patterns to support those lower speeds. And one of the significant things this does for the engineering community, because many of our engineers have always been concerned about liability, is by having all of this in the design manuals, they've got basically, they can do proper design without creating variations from the criteria or exceptions from AASHTO. So this is a significant benefit for both from a street design standpoint, from a safety standpoint, but also from a professional standpoint for the engineers that do this actual design. Likewise, while sidewalks, having a minimum sidewalk certainly improves safety, one of the things we realize is that we have to not just focus on safety, but comfort. And the way that you get that is by having wider sidewalks and larger setbacks from the moving, traveling motor vehicles, so that you can see, whereas before we had basically either a 5 or 6 foot sidewalk, and the state has always funded and maintained sidewalks. Now, based on the new criteria, the sidewalks can be 6, 8, 10, or 12 feet, again, based on the context. And this is hugely important to cities who for years have been trying to get wider sidewalks incorporated, primarily in redevelopment and new development projects such as what we're doing here in the city of Orlando. One of the reasons why I moved to Orlando when I was in the private sector was because the city understood these goals many years ago, and they developed a project called Baldwin Park. It's about 1,100 acres. It used to be a naval training center, and it's a completely mixed use. It is a new urban project. You can see it has a densely gridded network of streets, and there are 32 street connections between Baldwin Park and the adjacent street network. And while the adjacent city of Winter Park did not want these streets connected into their network, the city of Orlando prevailed and was able to create all of this grid. And it has, you could literally never leave Baldwin Park. That has A-rated schools, it has grocery stores, all kinds of restaurants and trails, and just wonderful facilities. It's where I take everyone and send everyone to see how projects can be done right. It's not perfect, but it's the best I've seen in the state of Florida. Likewise, Orlando was one of the early adopters of bringing major chain stores back into the downtown. This happens to be the store that I pass by as I ride my bike home from work every day. It's a Publix grocery store, which is our primary chain here. It's the first Publix that was not a standalone. It's actually on the ground floor of a condo building and has no surface parking lot. It shares a small parking garage underground with the rest of the retail that's on this entire block. So as a result of the things that DeWayne has talked about, and as our goals here in the city since I've come on board, the city actually already had 20 complete streets policy elements in our comprehensive plan, and has been focused on making sure that projects are done properly, especially in the downtown core. We have some suburbs, just like any large city, but in the downtown core and the corridors that are developing adjacent to the downtown, we're expanding those development patterns. As I mentioned, we've already in the process of becoming a Vision Zero city. We're doing one-way conversion studies. We have our main street is currently a one-way street that goes south, and then there's a companion one-way that goes to the north. The segment north of State Road 50, which runs east-west through Orlando. We're doing a study right now to convert that back to two-way, because we know that will help to support retail, with the goal to convert all of Orange Avenue eventually into two-way streets. And we've also have been working with the Florida DOT, with the district here, District 5, to do a corridor study to address both crashes and speeding, and I'm going to illustrate that here shortly. Some of our future initiatives, much of which is already underway and will be continuing. One of the things we haven't done a lot of is integrated land use and transportation corridor studies, which is something that DeWayne and I did significantly so in the private sector. And I did one in District 1. I funded one in District 1 before I left as the secretary with the city of Sarasota, and looking forward to doing some here in the city of Orlando with both the DOT and with the Orange County. And then likewise, we're going to be working with the district on our context classification of our city street corridors to support all of this change. So the Robinson Street Corridor Study was actually initiated by the person that's now my Transportation Engineering Division Manager. He was the Assistant Traffic Operations Engineer in District 5 at the time, and he asked me to come to the meeting with the city to help make this happen. This is a 4-lane undivided roadway that runs right next to Lake Eola, immediately adjacent to the downtown. You can see that this corridor quickly becomes a C5 or C6, depending on where you fit in the spectrum. And there's a park on the left side with a lake in the middle of it that's a historic park and is just packed with people at nights and on weekends. On the right side, you see some suburban office buildings kind of set back from the road in a conventional suburban pattern. These happen to be 9.5-foot lanes. And while the street is posted at 35, we have people driving, especially during the off-peaks as they drive east, 45 and 50 miles an hour through residential neighborhoods. So as we've been talking about, the context of this corridor, even though it's only about 1.5 miles long, changes. And based on the traffic volumes, we're comfortable that we're going to be able to do a road diet. It's in concept development phase, which will finish up in the spring, and we'll go into design. We'll be working with the district to make this happen. They actually have a resurfacing project that we're going to take advantage of to do some minor reconstruction. So this is the Central Business District, which is a C5 on this block. And you can see we've proposed a cycle track which happens to be on the south side that will go over into the neighborhood west of Interstate 4. And we have, in this case, it shows a bidirectional turn lane. The next segment is the Lake Eola district. This is the cross section that's going to replace what you saw in the photo previously. You can see the lake on the right. The cycle track will continue through this segment. And because we have so many pedestrian crossings on this segment, we'll be putting in crosswalks, which aren't illustrated here because we haven't finalized the locations, but we'll be putting in crosswalk with rectangular rapid flashing beacons, and we may actually be putting in some raised crosswalks as part of this process as we move forward, again, to help get the speeds down. And then the neighborhood district, there's a mixture of homes, both multifamily, single family, and homes that have become small offices. So this is more like a C4 district, and again, the medians to allow for crossings and to improve the landscaping. And then finally, we go into the Milk District, which is actually an industrial district. It used to be, well, it still is a dairy, which is why it's called the Milk District. And we have a lot of retail buildings and commercial buildings on the south side, which is the right side as you're looking at this photo. We don't have any permanent parking there, and this district is starting to redevelop fairly rapidly. It's one of our 10 Main Street districts, and so we need to provide on-street parking on that side. And you can see here that there are sharrows in the lanes. We're actually looking to potentially, over time, as the actual dairy redevelops, we'll be looking to put a cycle track on that side of the roadway. So a lot of things happening here in the city of Orlando. Thankfully, the direction the department has gone into helps support these
Unmuted.
Robinson Street because it is a state road. And with that, Robbie, I'm finished with my segment.
Okay, thank you very much. For those who didn't hear when we started, we are taking questions at the end of the webinar. And if you don't, you can type your question into the question box. If you don't see the question box, you may have to look for the little orange arrow in the upper right of your screen, and then you can just type in your question. My colleague it has been looking through the questions and sort of consolidating similar ones, so I'm going to let him go ahead and ask the ones that have come in, and Billy and DeWayne can answer those. So again, if you do need to log off, we will have a recording of the webinar up on our website tomorrow. You can find out more about upcoming webinars. You can subscribe to our newsletter, and you can follow us on Twitter at ssti.us. So Chris, why don't you go ahead and tell me what questions have come in.
Great, thanks, Robbie. Like Robbie said, I've tried to cluster similar questions together. The first question that I see popping up has to do with how the design guidelines were established. So things like sidewalk widths and design speeds. So where do those numbers come from generally? And I'm also going to add a follow-up to that, which is the role that those guidelines play. I know Billy showed some design standards. I'm not sure those were Orlando or the DOT. And in some states, the DOT actually owns and operates most of the roads. In other cases, the roads are owned locally, and they might look to the guidelines in terms of what they do. So that sort of two-part question that either of you can speak to, maybe starting with DeWayne, where the design guidelines come from and what role they play.
Sure. Of course, Billy and I have been doing this for a number of years before we came back to DOT, and we had a general idea of what types of design standards you tend to find in walkable areas. One of the things that we used to do when I was working in that field is when we went to a new town and we were developing a code for them, we would go out and measure their existing sidewalks in their best walkable places and try to give them a code that looked like their town, so they didn't get one that looked like somebody else's town or just a generic place. And so I did a little bit of that with this as well. We actually went out and, through the miracle of Google Earth, were able to sort of calibrate for Florida cities, how big the sidewalks tended to be in these different types of conditions. It would be great if we could just say, yeah, we're going to have 20-foot wide sidewalks in all our C6 areas, and we can have sidewalk dining and all those things. Our concern on the state roadway system was, one, having enough room to fit all these things in. In a lot of places, you can't really buy more right-of-way, but also, what really is appropriate for the best places in Florida. So that's what we try to do there, is calibrate those based on what we found in Florida's conditions. And that was also tempered by our own experience with knowing what tended to be a good size, say, for a sidewalk in a downtown area. What's the minimum that would work? What's a reasonable size? So it was a little bit of experience and a little bit of calibration for that. Billy, do you have any other insight on that?
No, I think you did well. There was a mention that the states, different states have different responsibilities. In Florida, the state has its own system, and then cities and counties have their own systems. So there's actually a separate document for city and county roads unless they adopt the state or their own, and that's called the Florida Green Book. There's actually a traditional neighborhood development chapter that I co-wrote with another colleague some time ago, and there's a handbook that goes along with it. And so that tool has been in place for cities and counties for about 4 years prior to this document coming out on the state system. So you'll see a lot of similarities between the two.
Great, thanks. Yeah, perfectly. I know there's probably a lot of questions about how the new context zones will play out in design and other design-related decisions. One specific one I see here is our new access management criteria based on context expected to be coming.
They are revising the access management criteria in Florida. We have an access management handbook, and they're revising that to be more compatible with context classification. And the deal that we made when we implemented this context classification system on the roadways was that it was really geared toward design. There are a lot of other ways that we talk about our roads. We talk about their functional classification. Is it an arterial or a collector? We talk about its access management class. We talk about its freight design considerations. So the deal we made was that all those things can still stay in place, and we'll figure out how to translate between them over time. And so that's the process that we're working on now. And in the 2 years we've been doing this, we've actually been working actively with all those different offices, access management, freight, and all those others, to make sure that we were going to be on the same page as we moved ahead. And so what we're finding is that they are beginning to update those things now, and in the future versions of them, you will see this context classification begin to play out.
Great, thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming in, loosely related to how these changes are being received locally, how they're being implemented locally, and I'll just give a flavor for some of the questions that are coming in. One that I know Billy has spoken about at one of our past community of practice meetings is how to manage things like rural and suburban areas that desire to be more urban, have more urban street design. That's one issue we see coming in. Maybe the opposite type of consideration is responding to pushback against lower speeds in places that are already congested streets. So if you're trying to implement, some slower speed design in places that people see as already having congestion problems, resistance to complete streets, all these types of local issues.
So I can speak to that, I think, because I presented close to 100 presentations over the last few years across the state on this subject through a number of means. And I would say that by and large, the communities have embraced this change. There's always, just like at the DOT, there's always going to be some people that are uncomfortable with change just because it is change. But by and large, I would say that by and large that it's very much embraced, and some local governments would say it's long overdue, including probably the city of Orlando. The issue with the speed, I think the best way to frame that is that the speed reductions that we're talking about, and we had a lot of discussion about this because it was a fairly heavy lift to get the speeds down to 25 from 40. Because we had a lot of concerns internal to the organization. And I think the best way to look at it is, and this is pretty true in most of the cities, except maybe the very large cities like New York and DC, but most cities, they have a fairly compact urban core, and it breaks down fairly quickly once you get outside the urban core. And so the amount of delay that's created by speed reductions in these urban places is insignificant compared to the amount of delay that most people experience at major signalized arterial intersections in the suburban environment. At least I can tell you in Florida and Texas, where I lived, in Houston and Florida, that is absolutely the case statewide. Even in our larger cities, the downtown core is fairly compact, whether it's Jacksonville or Miami, and then it breaks down into the suburbs. And the suburbs are always going to be a challenge, both in terms of speed reduction because of the nature of the land development patterns. I think the other question was, how do you achieve speed reductions? You achieve it, and this is something that we put into the discussion statewide, is that you achieve it through land development changes. So for example, in the city of Orlando, we have corridors that we know are ripe for redevelopment. We need to make sure the land development regulations support changes in speed and reduction in lane widths in accordance with the new design manual.
Amen, Brother Billy. I what's want to mention from the statewide perspective also, the issue with the design speed. You'll notice that was in Billy's presentation, but it wasn't in mine. We've actually stopped putting that slide in our presentations that we do with the department because we found it actually was creating a lot of confusion. Our idea behind those design speeds was that if you are dealing with Robinson Street, for instance, in downtown Orlando, then you had a road that used to operate at 25 or 30 miles an hour and needs to operate that way again. And so this would give our designers the flexibility to actually go back and build to that speed. That's a totally different situation than having a suburban area that was built at 45 to serve Walmarts and Home Depots, and you want to now move that down to a 25-mile-an-hour road. That is a much different condition. But what we found was that local governments were tending to look at that and go, oh, here's my C3 commercial. I want DOT to code this as C4 so that I can ask for 30 miles an hour on this roadway. It doesn't work that way. You have to change the land use first, and then we can come back and code it based on what the land use really is at that point. So that's one way that locals are responding to this, and that is an issue that we're encountering and trying very much to get the right message out on that.
Great. Maybe a couple fairly easy ones. Is FDOT working on the design manual update in-house or through a consultant?
The design manual update is done. It was released in November, earlier this month, and will become effective January 1st, and it was done. The work on it was done in-house, and now having said that, we did a lot of work on our Complete Streets Handbook, which eventually became the context classification document. A lot of that work on the context classes and stuff was done by Kittleson and Associates working for us as subconsultants or as consultants, and that then fed into the design manual. But all the design manual work, the heavy lifting of taking the old manual and rewriting all of it, that was all done in-house by FDOT staff in less than a year. It was a pretty amazing feat, watching those guys do all that.
Another one is the matrix used to determine context classification. Is that something that's available online?
Yes, it's in the context classification document. If you go to flcompletestreets.com, you can download a copy of it. It's 11 by 17, and it tells you how to use it. There's also some webinars you can look at on there. I'll kind of walk you through it. It takes about an hour to go through all of them.
Thanks. Some folks are asking questions about how this sort of framework of thinking about street design can feed into some other things that FDOT might be interested in. A couple on the list would be, incorporating better ADA accessibility type design guidelines and things like health equity. Is that a direction that this work could move towards?
I'll take a shot at that, and Billy may have some insight on this because he was a DOT secretary for District 1 as well, and has actually served as the state roadway design engineer in the past. ADA is law, and we abide by ADA according to the letter of the law, and we implement PROAG stuff as it's available and as it works for us as well. But we try to stick pretty close to what the law is on that, and so we feel like we'll continue to do that. And the best thing that we can do for ADA is to try to provide more livable places where folks of all different abilities can live and get around, and that's one of our goals with Complete Streets. Billy, did you have any other thoughts on that from your?
Yeah, we have been closely following and we're meeting the requirements of ADA going back into the early 90s, even on resurfacing projects. We will go in and fix ramps that don't meet ADA. So the DOT has been very aggressive about dealing with ADA for over 20 years. And from a health standpoint, obviously providing complete streets directly supports improved health because it gives people other options to get around other than just driving a car.
Yeah, our state bike ped coordinator is actually serving on the Department of Health's new plan that they're doing. She's serving on the committee for that. That's Mary O'Brien, she's state bicycle pedestrian coordinator, and she's serving on that, representing DOT.
Great. We've got a good question here about applying the context zones. I know this is something that comes up often when talking about things like transects. What's the process for determining, what zone an area should fall in? Does it apply on a street by street basis or sort of an area basis? And have you done some analysis to understand the additional costs of going through that process on sort of every project or every corridor?
That's a good question. I don't think we have time to go too deep into the weeds of how exactly that's done. What I can tell you is that we have a process in the handbook or in the context classification document that will be as detailed as you need it to be. What we've normally found is that once people have done this a few times, they begin to look at something very quickly and go C4. C3 residential, C3 commercial, and it doesn't take that much to look at it. And there's about 3 or 4 things that you're going to focus on immediately, and you'll know. And then you can, figure it out more closely from there if you need to. So in general, it's not that difficult to do once you've done it a few times. We are monitoring the cost of it, and most of the districts are having sub-consultants do this, and so we have a good way to kind of track how much they're spending on that. And as a part, once you actually teach the consultant to do it, and they've learned how to do it, then it's not that expensive to have it done afterwards. But we are monitoring the cost on it. It's not anything beyond what we expected. I don't have any actual, new per hour costs or anything like that to share with you at this time. We are monitoring those, and based on what we're seeing, we're not alarmed that the costs are going to be that high. The districts are also have been assigned to go out and context classify their entire district-wide network within the next 3 years. And so that'll be its own kind of front-end cost. And then the cost to maintain that over time will be, less than what it was to go out and do it right away. Billy, did you have any other experience with it when you were at District 1, or were you guys working with that at all?
We were already using that approach with the cities that we were working with, like Lakeland and Sarasota. So we already like many of the districts, we had already started even before the manual was complete.
Yeah, but DOT is a big organization. I mean, once you get this into the process and it's kind of part of the machine, it just sort of runs. It's turning out not to be as a big science experiment.
Great, thank you. In respect of folks' time, I think that's generally a good place to wrap up. I will say that we've got a ton of other questions, a lot of them having to do with specific design details, especially the example that Billy showed. We'll share those questions with the presenters, and I'll take it upon myself to invite you to reach out to these guys if you really do have specific questions about these design details.
Sure,
I think they're going to.
I'd be happy to do that. I'd be happy to do
absolutely.
that. I do have a meeting with the mayor, so I'm going to have to.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank our two presenters, and their contact information is on the slides. The slides and a recording of the webinar will be up on our website. And thank you very much to both DeWayne and Billy for sharing your insights. I think it's been a very popular topic. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
You're welcome. Everybody have a good afternoon.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.